Imagine a man dangling from a bridge at dawn, his pockets weighted with bricks, his secrets worth billions, and every institution that should have protected him now racing to erase his name from history. This is the story of Roberto Calvi, God's banker, and the conspiracy that still refuses to die. And this is the Midnight File. This is a true story. Before we step into the shadows together, I need to ask something of you. We're building something here, a place where the forgotten cases find voices again, and right now we're climbing toward 100 subscribers. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach that milestone. Because every case we open, every file we dust off, is another step toward understanding how power really operates when no one's watching. Now then, let's begin. But first, a question for you, wherever you are right now, at whatever hour you've chosen to listen. Leave a comment below and tell me, where in the world has this story reached you? Are you listening from New York, from London, from Sao Paulo, from Tokyo? We want to know how far these voices travel, how widely these forgotten truths can spread. So take a moment, type your location, and let's see just how global this community of truth seekers really is. And one more thing before we descend into this particular darkness. If this story moves you, if it makes you question what you thought you knew about power and corruption, do us a favor. We're aiming for just 20 likes on this video. 20 people willing to say, yes, this matters, this should be heard. It's a small thing, a single click, but it tells us you're here, that you're listening, that these stories still have power. So if you're ready, if you're willing to spend the next hour with me in the depths of one of Europe's most tangled conspiracies, go ahead. Hit that like button, then settle in, because what happened to Roberto Calvi is a story that will change how you see the world. Now let's open the file. There are some stories that begin not with a bang, but with a question mark, and Roberto Calvi's life ended beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, with more questions than answers. But to understand how a man comes to hang from scaffolding with bricks in his pockets and $15,000 in his underwear, we need to go back. Back to the beginning, to the rise of a banker who would become so entangled with the Vatican, the Mafia, and secret Masonic lodges that his very existence became a threat too dangerous to allow. Roberto Calvi was born in 1920, in an Italy still reeling from the First World War, a country that would soon embrace fascism and then suffer through another global conflict. He grew up in a world where institutions mattered, where the church held sway over souls and banks held sway over futures. By the time he reached adulthood, Calvi understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't held by those who shouted the loudest or governed the most openly. It was held by those who controlled the money, who decided which ventures lived and which died, who opened doors for some and closed them for others. He joined Banco Ambrosiano in the 1940s, and over the decades he climbed step by careful step, until by the 1970s he stood as chairman of Italy's largest private bank. It was an extraordinary position, one that granted him access to the inner circles of Italian society, from politicians to industrialists to the shadowy figures who operated in the spaces between legality and crime. But Calvi's most significant relationship wasn't with any of these. It was with the Vatican. The Institute for Religious Works, known colloquially as the Vatican Bank, was and remains one of the world's most secretive financial institutions. It operates under the sovereignty of the Holy See, which means it answers to no government, files no public reports, and operates largely beyond the reach of international financial regulators. For a man like Calvi, this opacity represented opportunity, and for the Vatican, Calvi represented access to the kind of financial maneuvering that an institution of God perhaps shouldn't be seen doing directly. This relationship earned Calvi a nickname that would follow him to his ending and beyond. God's banker. It sounded almost noble, didn't it? A man entrusted with the church's earthly wealth, a steward of sacred funds. But the reality was far darker, far more complex, and far more dangerous than any title could convey. By the late 1970s, Calvi had constructed a financial empire built not on solid ground, but on smoke and mirrors. He created a web of shell companies, dummy corporations, scattered across Panama, the Bahamas, Nicaragua, Liechtenstein, places where questions weren't asked and records could disappear. Through these entities, He moved staggering sums of money, billions of lire flowing through accounts that existed only on paper, controlled by people who existed only in name. The scheme was brilliant in its complexity. Banco Ambrosiano, the legitimate institution, would funnel money through its Bahamian subsidiary to these shell companies. The shell companies, ostensibly linked to or even controlled by the Vatican Bank, would then use these funds for purposes that ranged from the merely questionable to the potentially treasonous. There were allegations, never fully proven but never fully dismissed, that Calvi's network funneled money to support anti-communist movements in Latin America and Eastern Europe. The Nicaraguan Contras fighting against the Sandinista government, the Solidarity movement in Poland, challenging Soviet dominance. These were causes the CIA supported, causes that powerful elements within the Vatican supported, and causes that required money that couldn't be traced back to official government budgets. But alongside these geopolitical machinations, there was something else flowing through Calvi's network: criminal money, mafia money, the proceeds of narcotics trafficking, contraband cigarettes, extortion, and every other revenue stream that organized crime had perfected over decades. The Sicilian Mafia needed to clean this money, to make it appear legitimate, and Calvi provided the infrastructure to do exactly that. For a while, everyone won. The Vatican gained financial returns and plausible deniability. The intelligence services gained funding mechanisms for covert operations. The Mafia gained clean money, and Calvi gained power, connections, and wealth. But like all such arrangements, it contained the seeds of its own destruction. In 1978, the Bank of Italy, Italy's central banking authority, conducted an inspection of Banco Ambrosiano's operations. What they found shook the Italian financial system to its foundations. Billions of lire had been illegally exported, moved out of Italy in violation of currency laws. The inspection revealed the shadow network of offshore companies, the unsecured loans, the missing documentation. It was the first crack in the facade, the first indication that Calvi's empire was built on sand. Investigations intensified. Journalists began asking questions. Politicians who had benefited from Calvi's generosity suddenly found their names appearing in uncomfortable contexts. And Calvi himself, the man who had always operated in shadows, found himself increasingly exposed to harsh light. In 1981, he was convicted of illegally exporting $26.4 million and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was released on bail pending appeal, but the experience shook him profoundly. While incarcerated, he reportedly attempted to take his own life, a moment of despair that would take on grim significance in light of what came later. The man who had controlled billions, who had the Pope's telephone number and the Mafia's trust, found himself sitting in a cell, contemplating the ruins of everything he had built. But the worst was yet to come. By May 1982, the financial house of cards was collapsing in earnest. The Bank of Italy, recognizing the systemic threat that Banco Ambrosiano posed, dissolved the bank's administration. When auditors and investigators began their work in earnest, they discovered something that defied comprehension. $1.3 billion was simply gone, not misplaced, not temporarily transferred, but missing, unaccounted for, vanished into the offshore labyrinth that Calvi had constructed. In today's currency, adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $4.2 billion. It was a staggering sum, enough to destabilize an economy, enough to represent lifetimes of criminal proceeds, enough to get a man eliminated if the wrong people believed he had stolen it. The bank's stock price crashed 13% on its first day of trading after the revelation. Panic spread through Italian financial circles. Who else was exposed? Which other institutions had entangled themselves with Calvi's schemes? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. On June 17, 1982, Roberto Calvi was formally removed from his position as chairman of Banco Ambrosiano. The man who had been God's banker was now simply a banker without a bank, a man without protection, a man who knew far too much about far too many powerful people. And he knew exactly what that meant. If you're feeling the weight of this story, the sense that something terrible is approaching and there's no way to stop it, then you understand exactly how Roberto Calvi, must have felt in those final days. Before we continue, before we follow him to London and to his ending beneath that bridge, take a moment. Share this story with someone who appreciates real investigative journalism, who understands that the most frightening stories are the ones that actually happened. Send them the link. Tell them about the Midnight File, because stories like this need to be told, and they need to be heard. Now let's follow Calvi into his final days. On June 5, 1982, 12 days before his formal removal from Banco Ambrosiano, Roberto Calvi sat down and wrote a letter, not to his family, not to his lawyers, but to Pope John Paul II himself. The letter was desperate, the words of a man who understood that powerful forces were closing in and that his options were narrowing to nothing. He described himself as the Pope's last hope, a phrase heavy with irony given what was coming. He warned of a pending catastrophe of unimaginable proportions in which the Church will suffer the gravest damage. He was offering information, offering cooperation, offering to reveal everything he knew about the Vatican Bank's involvement in his schemes. He was, in essence, asking the Pope to save him. No meaningful response came from the Vatican. The Church, it seemed, had decided that Roberto Calvi was a problem to be isolated, not a soul to be saved. Whether this silence represented calculation or simply bureaucratic indifference, we'll never know. But for Calvi, it must have confirmed his worst fears. He was alone. 4 days after writing that letter on June 11th, Roberto Calvi made his decision. He would run. Using a forged passport that identified him as Gian Roberto Calvini, a name just close enough to his own to be remembered, just different enough to fool a casual inspection, he boarded a private plane. He traveled through Venice, that ancient city of merchants and intrigue, carrying a briefcase filled with documents. What exactly those documents contained, we don't know. Financial records, perhaps, names of conspirators, evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of Italian society and the Vatican itself. We know he had them because witnesses saw the briefcase. We don't know what happened to them because by the time Calvi's body was found, the briefcase had vanished. From Venice, Calvi made his way to London, arriving in a city that must have felt both foreign and oddly appropriate. London, after all, was a capital of finance, a place where money moved in torrents through institutions that prided themselves on discretion. If anywhere could hide a man like Calvi, it would be here. On June 13th, he checked into the Chelsea Cloisters, a residential hotel in central London. It was an unremarkable choice, the kind of place where a man could disappear into anonymity, where questions weren't asked as long as the bill was paid. He was using his false name, carrying his false passport, living a false life in those final days. Did he believe he could vanish permanently, start over somewhere beyond the reach of those hunting him? Or did he understand, on some level, that there was no escape, that the only question remaining was how much pain his ending would involve? We know he made phone calls during those days in London. We know he met with people, though the details of these meetings remain murky. What we know for certain is that on the evening of June 17th, Roberto Calvi left the Chelsea Cloisters. He walked out into a London night, and he never returned to that room alive. The next morning, June 18, 1982, a postal clerk was cycling to work along the Thames. It was early, the city just beginning to wake, and as he passed beneath Blackfriars Bridge, something caught his eye. A shape that didn't belong, hanging from the scaffolding that clung to the underside of the bridge. He stopped, looked closer, and realized with horror what he was seeing. A body. A man in an expensive suit, suspended by a rope around his neck, swaying slightly in the morning breeze above the dark water of the Thames. The police arrived quickly. They secured the scene, photographed everything, began the grim work of documenting what appeared to be another tragedy in a city that saw its share of them. But as they examined the body more closely, as they inventoried what this dead man carried, the strangeness of the situation began to reveal itself. His pockets, the pockets of his expensive suit, were filled with bricks and chunks of concrete. Not small pieces, but substantial weights, approximately 11 pounds total. His underwear, accessed through the fly opening, also contained bricks. Why would a man preparing to hang himself stuff his clothing with masonry? He carried $15,000 in various currencies: British pounds, Italian lira, Swiss francs. A small fortune, the kind of money that suggested either desperation or preparation, but certainly not poverty. The forged passport identified him as Gian Roberto Calvini. It would take time to confirm that this was actually Roberto Calvi, the missing Italian banker, but the identification would come. And then there was the rope itself. The knot around his neck wasn't a simple noose, the kind you'd expect from a hanging. It was tied in what's known as a lover's knot, an unusual choice that suggested either someone with specific knowledge of ropework or someone sending a message. The location, too, seemed significant once investigators understood who they'd found. Blackfriars Bridge. Blackfriars. The term would resonate in strange ways as the investigation deepened. Within hours, the body was identified as Roberto Calvi. Within days, the international press was ablaze with the story. God's banker, the man at the center of Italy's greatest financial scandal, found hanging under a London bridge with bricks in his pockets. It was sensational, it was bizarre, and it demanded explanation. The initial official response came quickly, perhaps too quickly. In July 1982, just weeks after the discovery, a London coroner's inquest ruled Calvi's passing a self-inflicted act. The forensic pathologist, Professor Simpson, concluded that this was a case of self-suspension. The implication was clear. Calvi, faced with ruin, scandal, and likely imprisonment, had chosen to end his own life in this dramatic fashion. But nothing about the scene made sense for self-infliction. The bricks, the money, the location, the rope, the position of the body. Every detail seemed to contradict the official conclusion, and Calvi's family knew it. They hired George Carman QC, one of Britain's most formidable legal minds, to challenge the verdict. Carman tore apart the official conclusion, pointing out the impossibilities, the contradictions, the evidence that had been ignored or explained away. In July 1983, a second inquest overturned the initial ruling. Instead of declaring this a self-inflicted act, the court issued an open verdict, legal terminology, meaning they could not determine exactly what had happened. It wasn't an exoneration, but it wasn't an accusation either. It was an admission of uncertainty, an acknowledgement that the truth remained hidden. And there the case might have remained, filed away as one of those mysteries that occasionally surface in major cities, a strange death that defied easy explanation but generated no answers, except that Calvi's family refused to let it rest. In 1992, they commissioned a comprehensive forensic reinvestigation. They hired Kroll Associates and Forensic Access, firms that specialized in exactly this kind of complex forensic work. But the investigation faced an immediate problem. Calvi's body had been buried, and much of the physical evidence had been lost or degraded over the intervening decade. Then, in 1998, came an extraordinary development. Parts of Calvi's body, preserved tissue samples and items of his clothing, were discovered in a Milan medical institute. They had been retained from the original autopsy, stored away and forgotten, and now they represented a second chance. Using modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1982, scientists could re-examine the evidence and potentially answer the questions that had haunted this case for 16 years. What they found was damning. The forensic analysis revealed that the injuries to Calvi's neck were inconsistent with a self-inflicted hanging. When someone hangs themselves, the weight of their own body creates a specific pattern of ligature marks and internal damage. The marks on Calvi's neck didn't match that pattern. Instead, they suggested external force, strangulation, the kind of injuries you'd see when someone is choked and then positioned to simulate a hanging. The bricks presented their own evidence. Forensic scientists examined Calvi's hands microscopically, looking for traces of brick residue, mortar, dust, anything that would indicate he had handled the bricks himself. They found nothing. His hands were clean. If Calvi had stuffed bricks into his own pockets and underwear, his hands would have carried traces of that contact. They didn't. His fingernails told a similar story. No traces of rust, despite allegedly climbing on metal scaffolding. No paint chips, no stone dust, none of the microscopic debris that would inevitably be present if Calvi had physically positioned himself on that scaffolding. The forensic team conducted an experiment. They placed similar bricks in their own clothing and walked around. Within minutes, they developed significant chafing on their thighs, the rough edges of the bricks abrading skin through fabric. Calvi's body bore no such marks. The bricks, the evidence suggested, had been placed on his body after his passing, after he was already deceased, as part of staging a scene. Most tellingly, the analysis of Calvi's hands showed that he had never touched the rope, never grasped the scaffolding, never handled any of the materials that surrounded him in his final position. The inescapable conclusion was that Roberto Calvi had not positioned himself under Blackfriars Bridge. Someone else had done that for him. In October 2002, a panel of Italian forensic judges reviewed all of this evidence and issued their conclusion. Roberto Calvi had been eliminated. His apparent self-inflicted passing was staged to conceal the actual crime. This wasn't suicide. This was cold-blooded termination, followed by an elaborate attempt to make it appear otherwise. The question now became not how Calvi had passed, but who had done it, and why. By July 2003, Italian prosecutors believed they had their answer. They named 4 suspects. In October 2005, the trial began in Rome. 5 defendants stood accused of orchestrating and executing the elimination of Roberto Calvi. Take a breath here, because this is where the story becomes not just a mystery but a window into how power really operates, how institutions protect themselves, and how justice can be simultaneously pursued and denied. Before we dive into the trial and its aftermath, if you're finding value in this deep investigation, if you appreciate the level of detail and research that goes into each episode, consider supporting us by leaving a comment below. Tell us what you think, tell us what other cases you'd like to see covered. Engagement like that helps these stories reach more people, helps ensure that voices like Calvi's, silenced in life, can still speak in memory. The prosecution's theory centered on organized crime, specifically the Sicilian Mafia known as Cosa Nostra. They argued that Calvi had been entrusted with laundering massive sums of criminal proceeds, money generated from narcotics trafficking, extortion, and various other illicit enterprises that the Mafia had perfected over generations. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed with $1.3 billion missing, the Mafia concluded that Calvi had either stolen the funds or lost them through incompetence or mismanagement. Either way, the money was gone and someone had to be held accountable. But there was another dimension to the prosecution's theory. Calvi wasn't just a liability because of missing money. He was a threat. He possessed intimate knowledge of how Mafia funds moved through legitimate institutions, how criminal proceeds were integrated into the legal economy, and crucially, who else was involved? Politicians, businessmen, maybe even law enforcement officials, all potentially exposed if Calvi chose to cooperate with investigators. And there were indications that Calvi was considering exactly that. The letter to the Pope, the documents he carried in his briefcase, his flight to London, all suggested a man preparing to talk, preparing to trade information for protection. The 5 defendants charged were a cross-section of Italian organized crime and its periphery. Giuseppe Calò, known as Pippo, was a convicted member of the Sicilian Mafia and allegedly served as the organization's chief financial officer, the man responsible for managing Cosa Nostra's money. If anyone would order an elimination over missing funds, it would be him. Flavio Carboni was a Sardinian businessman who had become close to Calvi in the final years, a man with known connections to organized crime figures and a reputation for operating in the gray zones between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. He had been with Calvi during his flight from Italy, had helped arrange his travel, had been one of the last people to see him alive. Ernesto Diotalevi was a Rome crime boss, allegedly connected to the Banda della Magliana, a criminal organization that had terrorized Rome through the 1970s and 80s. His role in the alleged conspiracy remained somewhat unclear, but prosecutors believed he had provided local support in Rome for the operation. Silvano Vittor had served as Calvi's bodyguard during his time in London, a position that gave him access and opportunity. The prosecution theorized that Vittor had betrayed his employer, facilitating the elimination rather than preventing it. Manuela Kleinzig was Carboni's Austrian girlfriend, allegedly involved in the logistical aspects of the conspiracy, though her exact role remained ambiguous. The trial lasted 20 months, from October 2005 through June 2007. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, demonstrating conclusively that Calvi had been eliminated and the scene staged. They brought forward testimony from Mafia informants, pentiti, who had turned against their former organizations, who spoke of Calvi's relationship with Cosa Nostra and the fury that erupted when the money vanished. They traced connections between the defendants, showing how each fit into a larger conspiracy. They asked for life sentences. In June 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. All 5 defendants were acquitted, insufficient evidence to prove their specific involvement in the crime. The prosecution's theory of how Calvi had been eliminated, and broadly why, was deemed credible. But connecting these specific individuals to the actual act, the jury couldn't make that leap with the evidence presented. In May 2010, appellate courts confirmed the acquittals. The defendants walked free, their reputations damaged perhaps, but their liberty intact. And yet, even in acquitting the defendants, the Rome court made a remarkable statement. They acknowledged that the prosecution's theory about Mafia involvement was more credible than any alternative explanation. They stated explicitly that it appeared Calvi's ending was decided as a punishment and to prevent him from revealing his relations with people who acted as a link to the criminal organization. So we're left with this extraordinary situation. The courts acknowledged that Calvi was eliminated, likely by Mafia figures, to prevent him from exposing powerful criminals and to punish him for losing their money. But no one has been convicted. The actual individuals who carried out the termination, who strangled Calvi and staged his body under that bridge, have never been identified. Justice remains frustrated, truth remains partial, and the most powerful people involved in this conspiracy remain protected by layers of deniability and institutional power. Because the Mafia, as dangerous and ruthless as it undoubtedly was, represented only one thread in the web that entangled Roberto Calvi. To understand why he had to be silenced, why no institution came to his aid, why the conspiracy to eliminate him succeeded so completely, we need to examine the other forces that shaped his life and his ending. We need to talk about the Vatican, about a secret Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due, and about the way these seemingly disparate powers intertwined in late 20th century Italy. I know we're deep into this story now, and I know the details are complex, the connections labyrinthine. But stay with me, because what we're about to explore represents something rare, a genuine glimpse behind the curtain of how power actually operates, how institutions that present themselves as moral authorities or defenders of order can become complicit in criminal conspiracy. If you're still here, if you're still listening, you're exactly the kind of person we're building the Midnight File for. So, take a moment, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's descend further into the shadows together. The Vatican's involvement in the Calvi affair represents one of the most troubling aspects of this entire story. The Catholic Church, an institution that claims moral authority over more than 1 billion people, that presents itself as a guardian of ethical behavior and spiritual truth, was deeply entangled in financial fraud on a scale that beggars belief. At the center of the Vatican's connection to Calvi stood Archbishop Paul Casimir Marcinkus, an American-born prelate who headed the Institute for Religious Works, the Vatican Bank. Marcinkus was a fascinating figure, a large man with a tough reputation who had served as a bodyguard to Pope Paul VI during foreign travels before rising to lead the Vatican's financial operations. He understood power, understood how money moved, and how discretion could be valuable, and he apparently understood that the Vatican's unique legal status offered opportunities that few other institutions possessed. Marcinkus had been introduced to Roberto Calvi through Michele Sindona, another corrupt financier whose story intersects with Calvi's in ways that seem almost too convenient to be coincidental. Through this connection, Marcinkus and Calvi developed a relationship that would entangle the Vatican in fraud, money laundering, and ultimately, potentially, a conspiracy that led to elimination. The mechanism they used was something called letters of comfort. These weren't formal guarantees, weren't legally binding contracts, but they served a crucial purpose. The Vatican Bank would issue these letters, essentially endorsing the legitimacy of the shell companies that Calvi had created, suggesting that these entities were connected to or controlled by the Vatican. With the Vatican's implicit backing, other financial institutions were willing to extend credit, to move money, to participate in transactions they might otherwise have questioned. Through this arrangement, Banco Ambrosiano created dummy companies scattered across the globe. Panama, Nicaragua, Liechtenstein, every tax haven and offshore jurisdiction that offered secrecy became home to another piece of Calvi's empire. These shells would borrow millions through Ambrosiano's Bahamian subsidiary, and then the money would flow. Some apparently went to legitimate, if questionable, investments, acquiring shares in media companies, funding business ventures. But other funds allegedly served more controversial purposes. There were persistent allegations that Calvi's network channeled money to support anti-communist movements during the Cold War. The Nicaraguan Contras, rebels fighting against the Sandinista government, allegedly received funding through this network. The Solidarity movement in Poland, challenging Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, may have benefited as well. These were causes that the CIA supported, often covertly, and causes that elements within the Vatican, fervently anti-communist, would have endorsed. Whether Calvi's network actually served this purpose, or whether these allegations represent disinformation or speculation, remains unclear. But the allegations persist, suggesting that the missing billions may have funded geopolitical objectives that powerful forces wanted to keep hidden. Then there was the criminal money. The Mafia's proceeds flowing through the same channels, mingling with intelligence funds and Vatican investments, until the distinction between sacred, strategic, and criminal became impossible to pass. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed and the scale of the fraud became undeniable, the Vatican faced a crisis. Their name, their reputation, their moral authority, all were at risk. Investigators wanted access to Vatican bank records. They wanted to question Marcinkus. They wanted to understand exactly what the Vatican had known and when they had known it. The Vatican's response was telling. In 1984, despite maintaining that they bore no legal responsibility for the debts of Banco Ambrosiano, despite insisting that the letters of comfort were not binding guarantees, the Vatican paid somewhere between $250 and $406 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors. They called it a goodwill gesture, an acknowledgement of moral involvement rather than legal liability. Think about that phrase for a moment. Moral involvement. The Vatican, the institution that claims to define morality for Catholics worldwide, acknowledged moral involvement in a scheme that defrauded investors of over $1 billion, that potentially laundered Mafia money, that may have funded covert operations and armed conflicts. But they paid money to make the problem go away rather than opening their records to investigators, rather than allowing full transparency about what had happened. And Archbishop Marcinkus, Italian prosecutors indicted him for being an accessory to fraudulent bankruptcy. But Marcinkus was a Vatican citizen, protected by the Lateran Treaty between Italy and the Holy See, the agreement that had created Vatican City as a sovereign state in 1929. Italy couldn't touch him. He remained inside Vatican walls, immune from prosecution, and eventually retired to Arizona, where he lived quietly until his passing in February 2006, never having faced trial, never having been compelled to answer in open court exactly what he had done and what he had known. So we're left wondering, did the Vatican simply enable Calvi's fraud through negligence and greed, or was the Vatican an active partner, using Calvi's network for purposes that required plausible deniability? And most darkly, when Calvi became a liability, when he threatened to expose the full extent of Vatican involvement, did the Church play any role in his elimination? The Vatican has never allowed investigators full access to relevant documents. They've never provided complete transparency about their relationship with Calvi or their knowledge of his operations. The stonewalling, the immunity, the payment of hundreds of millions of dollars to avoid deeper investigation all suggest an institution with something to hide, with secrets that decades later remain protected behind Vatican walls. But the Vatican wasn't the only secretive organization entangled with Roberto Calvi. There was another network, even more shadowy, even more explicitly conspiratorial, that may hold the key to understanding why Calvi had to be eliminated in such a symbolic, theatrical way. we need to talk about Propaganda Due, known as P2, a Masonic lodge that transcended anything most people imagine when they think of Freemasons. This wasn't a fraternal organization of businessmen engaging in charitable work and secret handshakes. This was, according to Italian investigators, nothing less than a shadow state, a conspiracy operating at the highest levels of Italian politics, military, intelligence, and finance. P2 was founded and led by Licio Gelli, a figure whose biography reads like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except it's all documented fact. Gelli had been a fascist war hero, had allegedly maintained connections with the SS during World War II, and had emerged from the war with networks of contacts across the political spectrum. By the 1970s, he had transformed P2 from a conventional Masonic lodge into something far more sinister. Investigations eventually revealed that P2 had approximately 1,000 members, an astonishing roster that included 2 cabinet ministers, 48 members of parliament, the heads of all 3 Italian intelligence agencies, military commanders, judges, police chiefs, and prominent businessmen. It was as if the country's entire power structure had a secret society running parallel to, and often superseding, official channels of authority. Members referred to themselves as Frati Neri, Blackfriars, and here we encounter one of the most unsettling coincidences in this entire story. Roberto Calvi was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge. Blackfriars. Was this mere chance? Or was the location chosen specifically to send a message, to signal to others within P2 that betrayal would not be tolerated, that even powerful members could be reached and eliminated? P2's activities went far beyond financial fraud. The organization was implicated in political instability during Italy's years of lead, a period of terrorism and political violence that convulsed the country through the 1970s and early 80s. There were allegations that P2 had plotted an actual coup d'état in 1970, the so-called Borghese coup, an attempt to overthrow the Italian Republic and install a more authoritarian regime. The coup allegedly failed at the last moment, but the fact that such a conspiracy could be organized by a network that included serving military officers and intelligence officials revealed the depth of P2's penetration into Italian institutions. Roberto Calvi was a known P2 member. So was Michele Sindona, the corrupt financier who had introduced Calvi to Marcinkus. The connections between Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, and P2 formed a triangle of power and corruption that shaped Italian society in ways that most citizens never understood. When investigators finally began unraveling P2 in 1981, when membership lists were discovered and the extent of the conspiracy became public, Italian society convulsed. How could so many powerful figures have belonged to a secret organization that apparently operated as a state within the state? How deeply had P2's tentacles reached into government, judiciary, military, and media? The official P2 was disbanded after these revelations. Gelli fled the country, avoiding prosecution for years, and the organization supposedly ceased to exist. But secret societies, by their nature, don't announce themselves when they reconstitute. If P2 survived in some form, if its networks of influence and conspiracy persisted beyond the official dissolution, then Roberto Calvi represented an extraordinary threat. He knew the members, he knew the financial arrangements, he knew where the bodies were buried, both figuratively and perhaps literally. And when he fled to London, carrying a briefcase full of documents, when he wrote to the Pope warning of catastrophe, he signaled that he was preparing to talk, to reveal everything in exchange for protection. For P2, or whatever remained of it, this couldn't be allowed. And so the theory goes that Calvi's elimination was ordered not just by the Mafia, not just to recover missing money or prevent exposure of criminal operations, but by elements of P2 seeking to protect their conspiracy from exposure. The theatrical nature of Calvi's ending supports this theory. The bricks stuffed in his clothing, potential Masonic symbolism, the location at Blackfriars Bridge echoing P2's internal name, the lover's knot used in the rope. Another possible symbol. It all suggests a carefully staged message, a warning to others within the network. This is what happens to those who betray us. This is what happens when you threaten to reveal our secrets. But like so many aspects of this case, the P2 theory, however compelling, remains unproven. Suggestive evidence, symbolic coincidences, logical motives, but no direct testimony, no forensic link, no smoking gun that definitively connects P2 to the elimination of Roberto Calvi. And so we're left with competing theories, each plausible, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none proven beyond doubt. The Mafia wanted him eliminated for losing their money and threatening to expose their operations. P2 wanted him silenced to protect their conspiracy. The Vatican perhaps wanted him gone before he could reveal the full extent of church involvement in fraud and money laundering. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, all three forces cooperated, recognizing that Calvi threatened all of them and that his elimination served everyone's interests. The Rome court, in explaining the acquittals of the 5 defendants, acknowledged this possibility explicitly. They noted that Calvi's elimination appeared to have been organized in concorso with others not yet identified, in conspiracy with others who have never been named, never been charged, never been brought to justice. Multiple parties, multiple motives, multiple conspiracies interweaving into a single act of elimination that silenced a man who knew too much about too many powerful institutions. We need to pause here and acknowledge something. This story is long, complex, filled with details that can overwhelm, but that complexity isn't accidental. It's the nature of real conspiracy, real corruption, how power actually operates at the highest levels. Simple stories are usually false stories. The truth about how power works, about how money moves, about how institutions protect themselves, that truth is always layered, always complicated, always resistant to easy summarization. So if you're still here, if you're following these threads, you're doing exactly the kind of work that matters, the kind of patient attention that real understanding requires. Consider sharing this with someone else, someone who won't be satisfied with simple explanations, someone who wants to understand how the world actually works beneath the surface narratives. Because the Midnight File exists for people like you, people who aren't afraid of complexity, who understand that the most important stories are often the most difficult to tell. The web of death surrounding the Calvi case deserves its own examination, because Roberto Calvi was far from the only person connected to this scandal who met an untimely ending. Michele Sindona, the Vatican financier who had introduced Calvi to Marcinkus, who had been part of the same networks of fraud and money laundering, passed away in March 1986 while serving a life sentence in an Italian prison. The official cause was cyanide poisoning. Sindona allegedly drank coffee laced with potassium cyanide. The question that has never been satisfactorily answered is whether this was self-inflicted, whether Sindona chose to end his own life rather than face the remainder of his sentence, or whether someone reached him even in prison to ensure his silence. Sindona knew everything that Calvi had known, and more. His passing, whether intentional or arranged, silenced another voice that could have exposed the full truth. Giorgio Ambrosoli was a lawyer appointed to liquidate Sindona's failed bank, to untangle the web of fraud and determine where the money had gone. He approached this task with integrity and determination, refusing to be intimidated or bought off. In 1979, he was shot and eliminated by organized crime figures, a direct retaliation for his work exposing the financial networks that connected legitimate institutions with criminal enterprises. His passing sent a clear message. Some investigations are too dangerous to pursue. Emilio Alessandrini was an investigating magistrate, a judge who had begun to unravel the connections between Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican, and organized crime. In 1979, he was gunned down in Milan, allegedly by members of Prima Linea, a far-left terrorist organization. But his investigations, his files, the threads he had been following, all suggested that his elimination served purposes beyond far-left ideology. He was getting too close to truths that powerful people wanted buried. Graziella Corrice was Roberto Calvi's personal secretary, a woman who had worked closely with him for years, who presumably knew his secrets, understood his operations, and could potentially testify about his activities. Shortly after Calvi's disappearance, before his body was found in London, Croce leaped from her office window in Milan, falling to her end on the pavement below. She left a note denouncing Calvi, expressing rage at what he had done, the damage he had caused. Was this genuine despair, a woman devastated by the collapse of everything she had devoted her career to, or was it coerced, a note written under duress before being forced out that window? We'll never know. Sergio Vaccari was a London associate of Calvi's with known ties to the Mafia. 3 months after Calvi's passing, Vaccari was found in his apartment, stabbed 15 times. Despite the obvious connection, despite finding a P2 membership list in Vaccari's flat, investigators somehow failed to meaningfully connect this elimination with Calvi's. The failure to investigate seems less like incompetence and more like deliberate blindness, a choice not to see what would require uncomfortable action. All these passings, all these conveniently silenced voices, they form a pattern. Anyone who knew too much, anyone who was investigating too deeply, anyone who might reveal the full truth about the network connecting the Vatican, organized crime, P2 and Italian political corruption, they ended up gone. Some officially by their own hand, some by violence, but all gone, all silent, all unable to testify. And what about the missing briefcase, the documents that Calvi carried with him to London? What became of them? If those documents existed, if they contained the evidence that Calvi believed would protect him or could bring down his enemies, where are they now? Hidden in some private collection? Destroyed decades ago, held by intelligence services as leverage against figures still living. We don't know. Like so much in this case, the most important pieces remain hidden. Nearly 42 years have passed since Roberto Calvi's body was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge. 42 years, and the central questions remain unanswered. We know he was eliminated. The forensic evidence proves that beyond reasonable doubt. We know broadly why. He threatened too many powerful institutions, knew too many secrets, represented too great a risk to too many forces. But we don't know definitively who ordered the hit, who carried it out, who staged that body beneath the bridge with bricks in its pockets and money in its underwear. The competing theories, Mafia, P2, Vatican intelligence services, they all remain plausible. The evidence supports all of them to some degree, proves none of them completely, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the genius of this conspiracy, if we can call it that, is precisely that the guilt is so diffused, so distributed across multiple institutions and multiple networks, that no single party can be held accountable. Everyone bears some responsibility, so no one can be prosecuted. Everyone benefits from silence, so the truth remains fractured, incomplete, frustratingly just out of reach. The $1.3 billion that disappeared from Banco Ambrosiano has never been fully accounted for. Some of it paid Vatican debts, some of it vanished into offshore accounts, some of it may still be moving through the financial system, laundered and relaundered until its origins are untraceable. But billions remain unaccounted for, and the people who might know where that money went are dead, silent, or protected by institutional immunity. The Vatican continues to operate the Institute for Religious Works, continues to benefit from its unique legal status, continues to resist full transparency about its financial operations. The reforms that followed the Calvi scandal were real but limited. The fundamental architecture that allowed this fraud to occur remains largely intact. The Mafia, despite decades of prosecutions and the testimony of informants, remains a force in Italian society and beyond. New generations replace the old. New enterprises replace those that have been shut down. And the fundamental logic of organized crime, the use of violence and corruption to generate profit, persists. And P2, officially disbanded in 1981, lives on in conspiracy theories and in the networks of power that its members created. Whether it still exists in any formal sense we can't know, but the model it represented, a secret society of powerful individuals coordinating across institutions to shape society according to their interests, that model hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's become more sophisticated, more subtle, more difficult to detect and prove. Roberto Calvi's ending stands as a testament to what happens when one person knows too much about how power really operates. He wasn't a good man. The evidence suggests he was complicit in fraud, money laundering, and schemes that funded violence and corruption. He profited enormously from his position at the center of these criminal networks. But he was also, in the end, a human being who found himself trapped in a web he had helped create, who tried desperately to escape and failed, who was eliminated to protect institutions that continue to exist and operate decades after his body was cut down from that bridge. The passings that surrounded him, Sindona, Ambrosoli, Alessandrini, Corroce, Vaccari, they remind us that this wasn't a single crime, but a systematic effort to silence anyone who might expose the truth. And that effort succeeded. The full truth remains hidden, protected by layers of institutional secrecy, diplomatic immunity, and the simple passage of time. We're left with fragments, forensic evidence of elimination, testimony from informants who may have had their own reasons to lie, financial records that reveal transactions but not ultimate purposes, theories that explain some facts but not others, and a fundamental question that echoes across the decades. In a society where the church, the government, the banks, the mafia, and secret societies all interpenetrate and collaborate, where does authority end and criminality begin? Who actually governs when official institutions are penetrated by conspiracies? And what hope is there for justice when the guilty are too powerful to prosecute? Roberto Calvi knew the answer to these questions. That knowledge got him eliminated. His passing was a message, not just to other potential informants, but to anyone who might imagine that truth and justice would prevail against institutional power. The message was clear. There are secrets too dangerous to reveal. There are networks too powerful to challenge. And there are endings that serve so many interests simultaneously that no individual can be held accountable. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. Roberto Calvi's secret is buried beneath layers of conspiracy, decades of silence, and the calculated indifference of institutions that survived his death and will outlive all of us. The truth hangs there, just out of reach. Like a body suspended beneath a bridge, visible but untouchable, known but unprovable. And perhaps that's the real horror of this story. Not just that a man was eliminated, but that the forces responsible operated with such impunity, such confidence, that they knew they could stage his passing in the middle of London, stuff his pockets with bricks, leave money and false passports on his body, and never face consequences. They knew that the complexity of the conspiracy, the number of powerful institutions involved, the weight of secrecy and institutional protection would be enough to ensure that justice remained forever frustrated. Roberto Calvi walked into the shadows and never walked out. The briefcase he carried vanished. The documents that might have exposed everything disappeared. And the people who orchestrated his elimination, who strangled him and positioned his body and staged a theatrical warning, they remain free, protected, untouchable. If stories like this haunt you, if they make you question the institutions we're told to trust, then you understand why the Midnight File exists. Subscribe because there are more files to open, more stories to tell, more truths that powerful forces would prefer remained hidden. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your theories, your own knowledge about this case or others like it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who won't be satisfied with comfortable lies and official narratives. The next file might be darker still, but we'll open it together, you and I, and we'll see what the shadows reveal. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Julian Cross, and this has been The Midnight File.